we have reached a point where in order to speak the very, very simple truth, the very obvious truth, we have to be toxified. And that's why we need the infrastructure to celebrate the things that we make. And they shouldn't celebrate them on a political ground. They should celebrate them on aesthetic grounds. But we should basically we have to build our own culture.
I'm Ben Weingarten, and this is Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten, a podcast where we talk with exceptional thinkers and doers about the most important ideas and issues of our time. In this week's episode, my guest is Andrew Klavan. Andrew is a truly unique person with a unique background. He went to Berkeley in the 70s where he studied literature, and then what followed was a long and storied career in the arts and media. He became a best-selling crime and suspense novelist. His books were turned into movies directed by people like Clint Eastwood. But unlike virtually everyone in the world in which he has lived and worked, he's an outspoken conservative, a change that happened over time. Today, Andrew writes for publications like City Journal and PJ Media, and he hosts an incredibly insightful and powerful podcast on the Daily Wire called The Andrew Klavan Show. Andrew is witty, and he's got a sense of humor, something that people on the right typically lack. He also has a keen understanding of the importance of narrative and storytelling to culture, an insight the left applies to its great advantage that the right often fails to even acknowledge. I wanted to talk to Andrew about his intellectual journey, the criticality of culture to politics, freedom of speech, and many more topics. Before we jump in, I have a simple request. If you like the conversation that you're about to hear, if you find it valuable, would you please consider subscribing to, rating, and reviewing this podcast in the iTunes store or wherever else you're listening to us? We'd be very grateful for your support. And if you want to find out more about the show, you can visit our website at benweingarten.com/bigideas and follow me on Twitter at bhweingarten. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Andrew Klavan. So, Andrew, first off, I want to thank you for coming to the inviting environs of the Upper West Side, where we may be the only two conservatives in this entire zip code.
You know, I lived on the Upper West Side, and it's great to be back. I'm sure then I was a liberal, so I fit in a little better.
Yeah, now you're the only one that's very happy that you're here. Yeah. And I'm happy that you're here as well. And I wanted to ask you about that. You said you were a liberal. If one were to look at your background, look at your resume, they'd say, how could this person hold the ideas that he holds today? You have a background in literature on the academic side. You are a writer, a screenwriter. You've created all sorts of content. You were in the Hollywood world. You grew up on the East Coast, and then you went to Berkeley from New York. I mean, how do you end up a conservative with that background?
Well, I always joke that my wife married a liberal Jew and ended up with a conservative Christian. You know, she's been very patient about it. But you know, I all my life, I mean, even as a little kid, I had this obsession that things should hang together, that things should make sense. And you shouldn't say something that conflicts with something else that you're saying. And, you should work. I remember just as a kid, even making up daydreams, they always had to make sense, just things connecting together. And really, in terms of my political journey, if I can call it that, you know, when Reagan came into power, he was treated just like Trump is being treated now. He was the worst. He was a movie actor. He was dumb. His entire worldview came from watching Bedtime with Bonzo and watching cowboy movies. He knew nothing. You know, I just completely believed that. I completely believed it. But you pay attention, and at one point, the economy is in the tank. Everything is going wrong, and people are lining up just to get a tank of gas. And then suddenly, it's happy days are here again, and the Berlin Wall is falling down. And people now, they lie about this relentlessly, but they tell you that, oh yeah, we all knew the Berlin Wall. No one except Ronald Reagan knew. I mean, he said to George Shultz, his Secretary of State, we're going to win the Cold War. And Shultz said, what do you mean? And he said, I mean, we win and they lose. And, you know, so when that happened, it was really the wall coming down. I just thought, you know, that old buzzard was right about everything. And if that was true, then the whole stuff about him being dumb, about his being a movie star, about his being a warmonger, it just didn't hold together. And that was just the beginning. It was like, you know, because like every liberal, what every liberal knows is that the other side is evil. That's what we knew. We didn't know exactly why we believed what we believed. We didn't know how we could be saying the stupid things we were saying, but we knew the other side were Nazis. And so that revelation that no, he was right, that things worked, that just was a turning point. And it was really like loosing a balloon. After that, I just kind of flew away. And at that point, I moved to England for 7 years. I lived in England for 7 years. And I didn't even know my politics was changing because I wasn't really paying attention to the Clinton years. And when I came back, the people who were speaking for me were Rush Limbaugh, the guys in the corner at NRO, who I used to call my imaginary friends because they were the only people who were saying the things that I believed. And it was just impossible not to change.
So you saw the outcomes of conservatism and essentially the notion of the facts of life proving to be conservative borne out in politics. Then intellectually, what happened? Did that spur you to then start reading the classics of the Western Canon, or in particular, the kind of the books that formed the American founding? What was your kind of intellectual journey from that point?
Well, part of this was I was extremely well-versed in the Western Canon because I wanted to be a writer. I thought, this is what I should know. This is my background. So I had read, by that time, everything. I mean, when I say everything, I had read, virtually every book in the canon. You can't find a list of 100 books you should read in the literary sphere, in the philosophical sphere, that I haven't hit. So that was the work I did to become a writer. So I was really well versed in that, but there were all these voices that I had just never really thought of. Just reading a book like Witness, which is a life-changing book, and all the the Hayek and all the people, and even I've never liked Ayn Rand. I've never liked her writing. I think she's a bad novelist, basically. But even coming back to her, who I had read her books and understanding what it was she was complaining about, because she's brilliant on economics, and just understanding that. So I did come back to all of that, and it really was this it's kind of pitiful when I think about it now, but I would sit there at my computer doing my work, and then every now and again just going over to the corner at NRO where guys like Jonah Goldberg, John Podhoretz, and all the great writers who were over there would chat, and I would just think, yes, that's what I mean. That's what I'm thinking. That's the point. And I remember John Podhoretz put up a comment about the three great poets of the 20th century, and he named one, and I wrote to him, and I guessed the other two. And that was how I got into contact with them, and that was what brought me in. Plus, a reporter I had worked with as a young man, right out of college. I had worked with a reporter, the only conservative I had ever met, openly conservative guy I'd ever met, and I saw that an article by him, and I hadn't talked to him in years and years, and I got in touch with him, and that really kind of brought me into the family.
What is it in the media, in entertainment, in the arts that makes it such that they're almost always fields dominated by leftists? And that even goes back in history, because art in its finest form is about revealing truths. And if the facts of life are conservative, well, you would think that people in the arts would see all that. But is there a psychological predisposition to leftism? What's your take?
Well, talent is blind, and so it lands on all kinds of people. Right now, right at this moment, we really do have a kind of blacklist or gray list keeping people from speaking, making it so it's not a welcome situation. I mean, I always remember that after the color barriers came down, there were still no blacks who were managers in baseball. And people would say on the air, they would say, well, they just don't have the capacity to be managers in baseball, which is hilarious now that you look at the record. But, if you bar the door and you put up a sign that says you're not welcome, when you open the door, no one's going to be waiting outside, right? It takes a couple of years for people to come. And so we're at that situation where the door is barred, and that is now. The big question is not whether conservatives have less talent than leftists, because when you think about it, most of our best writers, most of the best writers right now are way on the right. So you have Tom Stoppard, who I think is the best writer alive. You have David Mamet. You have Cormac McCarthy, who's never come out, but it's very clear that he's a conservative. I mean, these are kind of the big guys, and all these other people who are getting all the praise, they'll vanish. But Tom Stoppard's going to be around forever. So there's a lot of real talent on the right. I think there are two things where they have an advantage over us in the arts. One is everything is narrative to them, because we believe in the facts. We don't believe that the story is the truth. And they literally believe that if you can sell the narrative, that is the truth. So that makes narrative a very high stakes game for them in a way it simply isn't for us emotionally. I mean, I love nothing more than the arts. I love nothing more than stories, narratives, but I don't think that they're necessarily the truth. And I just don't think that you buy into something. When a story works, it is true, but it's not necessarily what the writer thinks is true. So they do have that advantage. They also have the advantage that conservatives tend to be a little bit rock-headed. They tend to say, well, if I go into this job, managing funds, I'll be a millionaire by the time I'm 25. If I go into this job writing poems, I'll starve to death and, no one will ever know who I am. And they're just not going to make that choice, where leftists, I think, are a little bit wilder, a little bit more able to do that, a little bit more unstrung, and they will do that. So I think they have advantages there.
How do you explain that classical liberal philosophy is an idealist philosophy, and the leftist philosophy, let's call it progressivism or whatever you want to call the different strands of it, is materialist, yet the left is all about, like you said, kind of there's a free spirit, there's the idea of creativity, being virtuous, and the like, and it's our side that's all about, well, we like low taxes because low taxes lead to these 50 positive benefits, as opposed to we like low taxes because you earned your money, and what's fair and what's just is that you reap what you sow, you work hard, you earn something from it. Why does the other side control the idealist narrative when we should be the idealists?
Because we don't tell stories. I mean, you ever see Paul Ryan selling it's hilarious, pointing at the graph with a stick, and you just want to rip your eyeballs out. Please, Paul, stop. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is what I always try to talk about. I really dislike that we talk so much about the practical applications of what we do, even if we're talking about marriage. When we say, if you get married at a certain time and you don't have kids unless you're married, you won't be poor. Well, yes, that's also true. But it is also true that there is a way there is a purpose to our love lives and our sex lives, and if you don't live out that purpose, you'll be living nothing. You'll be living this meaningless string of relationships that won't go anywhere, and you'll be less happy. And I think that when we I was just giving a speech to college students who I think I must have shocked them down to their souls. But I was talking about the pursuit of happiness and the idea of happiness that goes back to Socrates, and it's not, when I hear conservatives talk about happiness, I hear them talking about, well, you could build a business if you want, and you can live in the woods if and I think that's not what happiness is. Happiness is very strictly tied to virtue. Virtue is very strictly tied to liberty. It all makes sense. I mean, this is the thing. What we say makes sense. And when we start arguing in a practical way, I think I know why we do it. I think we think it's the immediate problem, that if we talk in ideal terms, we won't be selling the immediate benefits, and there is a purpose to that. But you're right. You've got to tell a moral story. And we have a moral story to tell. In fact, we have the moral story to tell. And the only way the left ever tells good stories is by pretending they're conservatives and then inserting propaganda into those good stories. So if you watch their best movies, their most successful movies, Avatar and things like that, they're really selling conservative values and then plugging in leftist ideas into them to make it propaganda.
Let's say you had an infinite budget, an infinite power. How would you change the culture given the way the cards are stacked today?
Great question. It's a great question. And here is the best answer I can give you. Political movements and politicians and political people don't make art. Artists make art. People like me make art. I mean, I'm like nuts, right? I walk around and I think up stories about people who don't exist, and I put them together and I work really hard to make them real. And that's a crazy thing to do. And it's people like me who make art. You do not make art thinking, you know what, I'm going to change people's minds. You make art thinking, this is the thing I want to express. This is the story. And I think it's going to be delightful and beautiful. Because talent is blind, there'll be people who can do that on the left and right. What we need is a place of welcome. We need a place where you can go and pitch a story, if it's to the movies, or write a book that has values that resonate with conservatives that are true values, conservative values, and find welcome and find a living and find people who will make that movie, who will produce that TV show, who will publish that book. The trick here, and this is the trick that conservatives stumble on all the time, is that conservative art doesn't look like conservative life, right? To me, one of the truly great works of my life and a truly conservative work is The Sopranos. It's filled with filthy language. It's filled with nudity. It's filled with violence. And, we get these kind of, I'm trying to think of a polite way to put it, but we get these kind of, stick up the spine people who just think like, wow, that's not conservative. Look what they're doing. Those women have their shirts off, that can't be, how can that possibly be conservative? Well, it's a story about the moral law. It's a story in which everything goes wrong for people because they do not follow the moral law. And it's an amazing story about stagnation and how people don't change, and how even when the presence of God, there's one episode where God ultimately enters the story and everybody just ignores him, it's an amazing piece of work. And so conservatives have to stop holding artwork that is helpful to some kind of political standard. Whenever I hear somebody say, oh, this work of art normalizes homosexuality, I think, well, homosexuality is normal. It's obviously been around forever, so it's not like something that we invented in a lab. I mean, it's obviously a natural thing. And you can talk about, there's a wonderful gay character on The Shield who was conflicted with his religion. It was very realistic, and it didn't condemn him on either side. It just showed the struggle that he was going through. So you can tell all kinds of stories about people if you're not constricted by political correctness. So what I would say is we need both a home for artists. We need a home for artists, and we need an enlightened audience, an audience that reads. We need an infrastructure. This is what the left has. They have the Oscars, they have the Emmys, they have the Grammys, they have the New York Times, they have all the things that review NPR. I mean, NPR is a wonderful station if you happen to be a communist. It's just you can. That's where you can go to hear the latest, jazz review, the latest art review, and hear intelligent people speaking with passion about something, and not just speaking about whether it fits the bill or not. A good example recently was the film Get Out. Which basically puts forward the story of a black guy, who wants to sort of move into upper-class white liberal society and realizes they're only out to steal his soul. I mean, that's without giving away the plot. That's basically what it's about. And I had a conversation with Ben Shapiro about this, where Ben said, that's terrible. That's a racist message. And I said, no, that's a work of horror. That's a horror story, because it is showing you that assimilation comes with a price, and it's giving you the horror version of that price. And I would rather in real life we understood that it's worth assimilating. That's a good thing. But I think you can tell a horror story about that. I think that's a fair work of art and tells a true thing about the cost of assimilation.
So in order to not be branded the conservative Weinstein brothers, although leaving aside the personal issues, or the conservative NPR, is it then about, do you have to play to kind of the predilections of society in terms of the makeup of the cast and kind of the narratives themselves, so that while the narratives ultimately bring out truths and bring out a perspective that is not there, it's sort of covered with the veneer of progressivism? Because otherwise you're toxified immediately. It's, oh, this is if Roger Ailes was Walt Disney, here's what he would do.
No, I think we should be toxified. Actually, I don't think we should do that. I mean, the model conservative movie for me would be American Sniper. Complex story, not a rah-rah war movie, nothing like that, but just a story in which the people who believe in freedom are the good guys and the people who believe in not freedom are the bad guys, because that's really the way it works, right? So, they made a dozen anti-war movies that all bombed, more than a dozen. It was one of the low points in Hollywood, because our soldiers were in the field while they were propagandizing for this horrible enemy we were fighting. And they all bombed, and so help me, they were writing in Variety, which is a show business trade paper. They were writing, people just don't want to see wars about the war on movies about the war on terror. And I thought, yeah, they don't want to see movies about the war on terror in which we're rapists and killers and we're the bad guys, because they know that's not true. American Sniper came out and was a huge hit, and they said, oh, that's kind of confusing. What's the difference here? They didn't understand it. we shouldn't even, I mean, and it didn't win the Oscar, which it deserved only by about 50 miles. It was like better than any picture that had been made in 20 years. So I think we should be willing to be toxified. Part of the thing we have to accomplish, and this is where we have to be openly right-wing. Because, I don't care if a movie is openly right-wing or not, as long as it tells the truth. But I think one way we should be openly right-wing is to say things that you're not allowed to say. Because that is the thing, that's the prison they've put us in. That political correctness is a mental prison. We've got to start saying, there's dysfunction in the black community. That's what's the problem is there. There is a cancer in the House of Islam. Women and men are different than one another, and women get incredible pleasure and joy out of being homemakers and raising children, and they don't have to be the greatest athlete in the world. And if a woman punches a man in the face, he'll kill her. He won't go rolling out the door like he does in the movies. Those are the things we have to say just because they're true. And we have reached a point where in order to speak the very, very simple truth, the very obvious truth, we have to be toxified. And that's why we need the infrastructure to celebrate the things that we make. And they shouldn't celebrate them on a political ground. They should celebrate them on aesthetic grounds. But we should basically we have to build our own culture, because you cannot care. Too many conservatives care what the New York Times thinks of them. The New York Times is a piece of trash and should now be given out for a penny in supermarkets. I don't care what they say about me. They can come to my house and, throw things if they want. Too many conservatives are looking for that mainstream acknowledgement. What we have to do is build another mainstream.
When you walked into my apartment where we're recording this, you noticed in my library, yes, the library on the Upper West Side, it just sounds so pompous. But yes, there's a little library here with some books, one of which is The Power Broker. And You asked me if I had read it, to which I responded, I'm about halfway through it. And most people, I think, just have it because it's a form of virtue signaling. It's a book that you have to have because it's very long, and Robert Caro wrote it. Why did you ask about that book?
That book taught me more about politics than any other book, because it's so detailed in the way that he manipulated his way through the city and how the city was run. And it showed you how the things that were being reported had nothing to do with what was actually going on. And it's just an amazingly detailed look at just how the gears of politics work. And I just think it's a great story. And so, when I saw it, I always think, like, if you've read that book, you know something that people who haven't read that book do not know. There's no other book like it, really. And I've read the first in his volume of Caro's volume about Lyndon Johnson, but I haven't read the whole thing. And I hear he does a lot of the same thing.
Yeah, it's tough because each of the books are like 1,000 pages.
1,000 pages, I know. I don't know how he does.
And I think you also see in that book in particular, because it's about human nature and how we are corrupted people, he is sort of the archetype of so many different characters and storylines that you see in almost everything. I know you've written a couple articles, at least, on House of Cards, and I always try to say in a show like that, set aside whatever the politics is, because it's going to be ridiculous that's being portrayed in the show. But in terms of showing kind of this is how base politics really is, and it really is for almost all the people in the system about power. It's not about ideas. I think there is something valuable to that, and there is almost a libertarian message in it if you take it to its logical conclusion, which is these people, first of all, everyone is corrupted in one way or another, but in particular where there's power, corrupted people are drawn to it, and even if they're not, they become more corrupted over time. So you should be against more of these people making decisions that impact your life. But does it work out like that? Because I sense it's more like Wall Street, where people say, oh, Gordon Gekko is a bad guy, but I want to go become an investment banker after.
Well, House of Cards is interesting because it's a perfect example of what I was talking about before, of how the left takes right-wing stories and inserts propaganda. So the guy in that is a Democrat, right? And he's, obviously a terrible guy, but he's always on the right side of every issue. So he's always pushing things like tax cuts. And then the Republicans are saying, you can't cut taxes. And you go like, wait a minute, what did I just see? And so you look at that and you think, they're just selling you the word Democrat. They're just selling you Democrats because they're Democrats. That was in between. The actor chasing the boys around, doing what Democrats actually do when they, And I think about that. I think about the movie V for Vendetta, a good story in which Christians are oppressing people, but Islam is a beautiful thing, even if you disagree with it. And you think yeah, except no. That's not right. It really is not what is happening in the world. So they tell a good story, but they twist it around. They twist reality around to make you think the good guys are the bad guys are the good guys. And that is what makes House of Cards so disturbing to watch. And then, as you say, it does make you think this is politics. I don't trust any of these guys, which is always good. That's always a good thing. The original, by the way, was written by a Thatcherite. It was written in England. It's a British story written by a guy who was with Thatcher and was much more realistic.
Since you mentioned the Islamic supremacists generally and how, of course, they are portrayed as the good guys, and it represents the perfect kind of inversion that progressivism is love. I mean, they're the modern day sophists, I would say. So you have the Islamic supremacists, and then you also, in Hollywood, increasingly have China, where China is backing many movies and movie studios and building their own as well. Do the people in Hollywood realize who they've kind of gotten into bed with, and the fact that many of the movements that they support or the places and people from whom they take money oftentimes would basically put a knife to their throat if it came down to it at the end of the day? Or is it just these people are valuable in us furthering our viewpoint, and thus we can deal with the fact that maybe we wouldn't want to live under Sharia law, or maybe communism in China wouldn't be so much fun?
Well, there's two things at work. I mean, the fascination let me deal with the easy one first. I mean, the thing with Islam and versus Christianity, where an Islamic regime can throw a gay guy off a roof for being homosexual. The left doesn't say a word. But if Mike Pence says, I don't think homosexuality is quite the right thing, it's like, he's Mike Pence, he's a devil, he's a demon. And that I really do believe is just like when your friend says something to you, you listen to him, but when your dad or your mom says it, you go nuts. Because Christianity is who we are. No matter who we are, no matter what our religion is, if you're a Westerner, you were shaped by Christianity. And so when the Christians say things, it's their mom and dad. And that's why they get hysterical about it, because they hate Western culture, and therefore they hate Christianity. And Islam is just a stranger. It really doesn't have the same kind of moral weight. The other thing, though, is much more disturbing, which is the fascination the left has with totalitarianism. The famous Thomas Friedman line, if we could just be China for a day. The line, I mean, I don't know if you've read Steven Pinker's book about how wonderful everything is. And it basically, underneath it all, he's selling the idea that the experts have got this. It's the Wilsonian idea that things have just gotten too complex for little you, and little me. It's got to be handled by the experts. That's the FDR idea. We need this state, this administrative state, to take care of things. Barack Obama, he said the same thing. If I could just sit down with the experts and solve all our problems, that'd be great. But I've got this annoying democratic process to take care of. And this is their true belief. This is their true elitist self-love. It's a form of narcissism, I guess. There is nothing to support it except this, that experts in their field do expert things and do wonderful things. We love experts. We love scientists. We love all these people who figure things out, and it's great. But if you woke up every morning and I was standing over you with a gun and I told you what to do all day long and what to say and what to think all day long, holding a gun to your head, and I was always right so that your life went great, I still would have taken away from you the most important thing that you have. And they do not understand this. Pinker doesn't understand it. Obama didn't understand it. The press doesn't understand it. So they become fascinated with this idea of dad, sitting up on his throne, working it all out for us, because they all think they are that guy. They are the expert who's going to do it. And so they identify with him. The way they, you remember the school kids singing about Obama. I mean, it was just appalling. Chilling. It was chilling. And they really do have a fascination with autocracy and absolutism. It makes me laugh out loud to see them becoming hysterical. I don't mind them becoming hysterical about Trump. He's a wild guy. There's a lot to say good and bad about him. But he's made the executive office weaker purposely. He has made the government weaker. He has taken away his power, and that to them is, some kind of dictatorship. And I think that it really is a very disturbing trend on the left. This absolute dreamy fascination with the notion that as long as you get the economy working right, as long as you don't have high crime, and you have an autocrat, that's the perfect form of government.
I guess at its core, maybe what we can say is that for some who believe in that Wilsonian technocratic dream, for us nightmare, they want to supplant God with man, and the state is our church, and that is radical on the one hand, and they love the radicalism element of it, but then there's also the playing to the hubris of I'm superior to you and I should make decisions over your life. Yet these are the people who virtue signal, even though they would suggest there probably is no such thing as virtue because they're nihilists or moral relativists. On the one hand, they argue that they are virtuous, good, fair, just, but they want to be the oppressors and they want us to be the slaves. So how do you convey that to the public?
Well, that is the thing that happens. Luckily, they do overstep all the time because they really do want to take all your guns away. They really do want to take they take your vote away if they could. I mean, they really would. And so if you let them talk long enough, they kind of back into that. And you do have to remember that as much as people got kind of dreamy-eyed about Barack Obama, and he came across, he had a very winning personality, and he was an excellent politician. They voted every Democrat out of office while he was in power. Virtually every single Democrat in the country lost his seat during the Obama administration. So people do know, they do understand that they're being toyed with. I think on the right, we can be a little bit we can live too much in our heads. I keep hearing people say things like, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the government to take money away from one person and give it to another person. I agree. I think it's immoral to take money away from one person and give it to another person. But we've kind of lost that argument, and a certain amount, every developed democracy has a certain amount of social spending. It does seem to help things. It does seem to help people who are not really able to work in the culture. I'd like to keep it to the minimum, at which it actually works. But I don't think we can tell people anymore. I just don't think it's realistic to tell people anymore, we're going to get rid of this social safety net. Even Reagan didn't want to do that, and I think it's past that. When I see people, this is an issue that sticks in my mind because I think the right has just handled this as badly as it's possible to handle it. When I see people complaining about gay people being old enough to remember gay people being arrested for being gay, I think, we don't really want that. We don't, I remember it was back in the 80s, around 86, when the Supreme Court knocked down the sodomy laws, and the right was just reeling. And I thought, well, do you really want the state to have the power to kick down a guy's bedroom door because he's not doing it the way you think? And I thought, God knows the rest of us get up to all kinds of things, even with our wives. Do you want them? Sodomy has a fairly wide definition in law. It's like, and I thought, sometimes I feel like we're talking out of an imaginary universe, this kind of 1950s universe that wasn't really. It wasn't really the 1950s when it was actually the 1950s. And so I think that we lose a lot there. I always joke that conservatives can trace any event to the end of Western civilization. They can connect the dots and figure out how it gets to the end of Western civilization. So maybe we need to loosen up a little bit there. I
want to pick back up on something that you mentioned earlier about political correctness as a form of mind control or thought control. And really what political correctness is it's anti-truth, because it is blocking you from saying what you know to be true, and you can see it and you can feel it and touch it, and they don't want you to because it conflicts with their narrative. Where does, when you combine the political correctness with, trigger warnings, safe spaces, the cult of multiculturalism and identity politics, does this end up a circular firing squad where it becomes impossible to keep straight who is where in the hierarchy. And also, life is just not fun at all. And you go ultimately, oh, there they go again with almost everything that you see occur in society. And maybe you could say that Trump in part is a response to that because he's a guy who was politically incorrect. And people said, look, he's saying what I feel and no other politician is saying. But ultimately, does it collapse on itself, or does it just get progressively worse?
Well, it certainly can get so bad before it collapses. One hopes that it will always collapse, that the truth will out. But it can get awfully bad before that happens, And it really is, when we talk about culture, we tend to think about the movies, even though the movies aren't that important anymore. But we think about the movies, we think about TV, maybe books, a little bit, music, certainly. We don't think about manners. Manners are a very important part of our culture and really shape us almost more than anything else because they're what we do every day. And they're things, we don't say, do you open a door for a lady or do you not? Do you say, something at a dinner table or do you not? And the left hijacked that very, very important system of relationships. I mean, manners are important. It's important to be polite. It's important to be civil. And so it is weird with Trump that the thing that I like about him least is actually having the most beneficial effect. The fact that he is a bore, and he is a bore, there's no question about it. He's a mean-spirited, nasty little man in a lot of ways. And by the way, I think he's been doing a great job. I know I do, but, I'm just saying, he calls people names. He bullies people who supported him. He has no loyalty, nothing like that. But it is weird because he is shattering this thing that has wrapped us around like barbed wire. And I think that's a positive thing because I think the problem is not them tearing each other apart as they scream about their intersectional nonsense. The problem is us second guessing the words coming out of our mouth. The problem is us saying, was that joke racist? Who cares? Who cares? Racism is a philosophy. Do you hold it or not? Do you think that black people are like inferior to white people or not? If you don't, you're not a racist. So I always remember a guy making a remark to me, a friend making a remark to me, and then turning to me and saying, geez, maybe that was anti-Semitic. I said, it can't be anti-Semitic because you're not an anti-Semite. It's like, it's a sentence. It's words you spoke. Maybe it came out of, a tribal part of your head. So what, And I just think not to be able to tell jokes about men and women and the silly differences between them, not to be able to tell jokes about all the different races, I think it makes us more angry. I think it makes us more separate and more hostile toward one another because it all gets repressed. So I think it's just important to break that every single day. And it's weird because, I come from a revolutionary generation. I'm like a visitor from the 60s, basically. And I talk to people who are younger, people who are even in their late 30s, and they're shocked at the things that come out of my mouth. And I say to them, you agree with this. I hold no animosity toward anybody, truly, except individuals who do bad things. I'll say whatever I damn well please, and I just think that is what is needed because it is dangerous. And you are right. They will get into a circular firing squad. But before that happens, they could shoot a lot of the rest of us too,
Yeah, you are the counterculture once again.
No question about it. I feel this is the 60s for conservatives, yeah.
I've held a theory, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. I would suggest that the president, in a couple of ways, is a product of progressivism himself. One aspect of it being you talk about, let's say, his lack of decorum or diplomacy frequently. And so there's a part of that which we as conservatives would say, well, you're supposed to conduct yourself in a certain way and the like. But on the other hand, leftists have destroyed that sort of vision of society. The whole point was to go against the man and turn things on their head. So one aspect of it is he could only exist as a result of what progressives did. And then another element of it is that if you believe that you are completely ostracized and marginalized, Trump stands as a battering ram against people that want to take you out of society. So I'm thinking here in particular of Christians writ large, where you have folks who believe that their religious liberty is being stomped upon. And here's a guy who may not hold your beliefs deep in his heart, but he's going to fight for you. Both of those things, I would say, kind of stem pretty much directly from a progressivism where you have an identity politics which says we're going to destroy you if you don't come along with us.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. And I think, it's like when Trump gets up and he says in the NFL they should stand up for the flag, or he says they should say Merry Christmas. And the kind of intellectual, I won't call them never Trumpers because they, a lot of them have kind of moved to the middle a little bit, but the intellectual right sits and goes like, oh, what a demagogue. He doesn't care about, and he is demagoguing. There's no question about it. He's also right, and it matters. It matters that our athletes don't salute the flag, and you turn on ESPN and every single announcer says, well, they have the right to do that. They have the right, nobody disagrees that they have the right to do it. That doesn't make it right, and I think, when I was in New York for Christmas this year, and people were saying Merry Christmas. And I was glad. I think you should say Merry Christmas. I don't think you should have to even think about it. This is largely a Christian country. It's not an insult to say Merry Christmas to somebody who doesn't celebrate Christmas. If that's the worst thing that happens to them in their day, they've had a great time, And so he actually is achieving this. That is one part of this. And the thing about his incivility is you are absolutely right. I always think about this George Carlin, a radical comedian from the 60s who went and, he kind of became a radical. And he did this very famous routine. I think it was called the 7 words you can't say on TV. And he just strung together the worst curse words you could think of into one gigantic word. And he kept saying it over and over and over again. It's how silly it is that you can't say this. And hilarious. It was a hilarious routine. He was a hilarious comedian. But after a while, it dawns on you, that's totally untrue. That is totally wrong. If I can say the word tree and conjure in your mind the shape of a tree, then I can say something that turns the sex act vulgar into something vulgar and violent, and you get that idea. So those words do communicate something vulgar. They do communicate something violent. And if you can't get through a sentence without saying it, then you are cheapening our culture. The left only did that. We were complaining about it, and we were the Presbyterian, we were the stiff-necked Lutheran who wouldn't come to the party. I mean, so the fact that now Trump comes out and he embodies that, how is it supposed to be? Was it supposed to be only the president who didn't do it, but everybody else did? I mean, what do you think happens when you tear down the culture? And so I do think he is absolutely their creation. And it is like, I mean, I've said this a lot, he is like Godzilla. You set off a bomb and out of it comes this like mutated monster who just crushes everything around him. And I think that they set off the bomb.
As a content creator today, in some ways, all of us have more freedom than we've ever had to disseminate our ideas and create whatever we want more cheaply, more efficiently, faster than ever before, and get it in front of the eyeballs of more people faster than ever before. On the other hand, the kind of gatekeepers today are people who hate us. And I'm talking, of course, of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley who really think about the world in a lot of ways like people in Hollywood think about the world. Given that by the tweak of an algorithm or by the flip of a demonetization switch, these platforms can destroy a business and stop you from disseminating your content overnight, what do you think should be done, if anything, about it? And let me just say, my bias is towards the idea that the free market can handle this. And if 50% of people, let's say, are being discriminated against by these companies, then we should create parallel companies. Just like, to your point, we should create parallel infrastructure in media. What say you?
Well, where are these guys? This is what I want to know. Fox News comes along, and I think it was Charles Krauthammer who said they discovered a niche, just happened to be half the country, Where is the Fox comedy channel? Where is the Fox, drama channel? Where is the, conservatives? Why aren't conservatives not doing any of this? And serving people, I mean, especially the antic libertarian young, there's so many of them. I mean, young people by nature are libertarian. Leave me alone, Dad, and they want to hear like crazy comedians saying the unsayable. Why aren't we serving those people? And we do serve them on YouTube and online. And yes, you are right. Since just like it was when Reagan was elected, that the press started to say, oh my God, we can't tell the truth. We can't just be fair. We've got to stop these people. And in the same way, it was the election of Trump, where suddenly the fact that they were stealing information from us on Facebook which made Obama a genius, was now suddenly an evil Russian plot, So my question is, where are our billionaires who aren't saying, like, here is a well-made, YouTube channel where, it's not going to be conservative, but we're not going to keep you off it either. We're not going to silence anybody who wants to come on, comes on. Everybody can come on here. Where are those guys? Because I think YouTube would be deserted like that. Because it would just be the liberal channel. That's all it would be. And so people, if there's a liberal channel and yet you can get to, the free channel, then great. There is a point, and I've always said this, I've always believed this, everything in life needs bookends. Nothing, because we're not angels, as Madison said, we have to have government. And there is such a thing as monopoly. And there is a time when you have to say, you know what, you guys have gotten so big and good for you, but it is now impossible to get information online without going through you. And therefore, you have to deliver fair, you have to be fair, or you have to let everybody do it, or we have to break you up. And I do think there might come a point. I mean, Google has gotten so poisonous in some ways. Just getting information is now so difficult on Google to get the right-wing point of view. It's on page 4 all the time. And it used to be just wherever it was in the algorithm. I think there does come a time when I would support breaking some of these guys up and just saying, you're just too big. You're monopolizing the conversation. And in lieu of that, I would much rather, of course, see the free market handle it. And I just keep wondering, where are these guys? I'm not a billionaire. I can't do it, but we need those guys to do it.
Yeah, Google, as we speak, is presently surfacing all of the most negative Andrew Klavan hit pieces to the top right now.
Is it really?
Your work is like 10th page.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh, yeah. Because nobody. I always feel in this battle hilariously. There's a scene in War and Peace where the young Russian soldier goes into his first battle and he sees the French coming over the hill and he says, "They're trying to kill me, whom everyone loves." That's the way I always feel when I'm attacked. Why would anybody attack me? I'm such a lovable guy.
Now for the kind of news you can use part of all this. Who do you read, or what publications do you read on a regular basis to get angry, get excited, get inspired?
In terms of the news?
In terms of the news or culture, or more broadly, what do you use as your inspiration for your work?
Well, for my political work, I read a lot. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I read both the New York Times, which is now truly a piece of trash, and I read their op-ed page, which I call Knucklehead Row, because
why do you subject yourself to that?
Well, I do it because I just want to know, are they saying anything? I mean, now they've got some smart guys. Bret Stephens is a smart guy, and Ross Douthat, but it's like the Kool-Aid. They don't drink Kool-Aid anymore. They just inhale it, and they go over there, and I guess they have to be friends with people, and they get so beaten up if they say anything go off the reservation at all.
When you've got to be a never Trump conservative.
Yes, but they end up as liberals. I mean, David Brooks is now absurd. I mean, the stuff that comes out of his mouth, I just think, like, you got to be kidding me, But I read them, and I read, I think the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, conversely, is one of the best pages around. And the Wall Street Journal Saturday Review is also spectacular. And what's really interesting, by the way, is when I tell my friends in New York who only read the New York Times, most of them being liberal, I tell them, just look at the Wall Street Journal. They can't believe the things. They'll say to me, "I can't believe you're allowed to say that." And I think, allowed to, like, allowed to, have you read the First Amendment, And so I read all of those. And then there are sites that I find send me to good pieces. I've always loved Glenn Reynolds and Instapundit. I think he does an excellent job of, bringing stuff in, aggregating, as they say. I still like Drudge. He can get a little bit overexcited, but Hot Air does this too. And these are and I can't leave out Real Clear Politics, because Real Clear Politics really does a good job of getting the smartest left winger to a left wing op-ed against the smartest right wing op-ed. And when I talk to my liberal friends, I always send them there because it's hard to read stuff you disagree with. You know, it really is. It's hard to read guys ranting against somebody who might be your hero, but it really is worthwhile. And so I like to go to that site and just sample what everybody's doing. That's where I go for that, for my nonfiction work. For my fiction work, I'm still very much immersed in the classics. And I now find myself at this point, it's kind of weird to talk about because it's kind of weird to talk about reading as if it were an adventure. You know, I mean, you sound like a third grade teacher, you know, but I set out, I educated myself. Even when I went to college, I didn't pay any attention. I, drank and played my way through college. And when I got out, but I had bought all the books. I had bought all the books. And when I got out, I read all the books. I read them, every single one from page one to the last page. And but it took me 15 years. And at the end of 15 years, I remember walking out of a pharmacy in London and just thinking, I'm actually educated now. I actually know stuff. And now I find myself going back to a lot of the classics, and they suddenly all make sense to me, in a way, because when you first read them, you're building a context. When you come back to them, you're reading them in that context, and it's like having fireworks go off in your head. Suddenly. I joke all the time that to my wife, I always say, now that I understand everything, it's like everything makes sense. And it really does come after a while where you think like, I can plug Nietzsche in here, and I can plug Kant in here, and I can plug Shakespeare in here, and I get what they're saying. I get what they're talking about. It's a really exciting experience. It's fun to understand these guys who have been my friends for life and suddenly understand where they're coming from.
If you could narrow it down to, let's say, 3 to 5 books, what are the ones that had the greatest impact on your life?
Well, there's absolutely no question that the book that had the greatest impact on my life was Crime and Punishment. And when I was in college, so we're talking the 70s, right? When I was in college, it was moral relativism was just rising to the surface. Political correctness was just taking hold. And then I was kind of crazy. I was crazy, and I wasn't really paying any attention. I noticed sometimes people were screaming at me about something, but I wasn't paying any attention to them. But I did hear this moral relativism, and it did really affect me. And it was the intellectual air you breathe. And I read Crime and Punishment, and I remember putting that book down, this old Signet paperback. I remember putting it down and covering my face with my hands and thinking, this is the truth. There is a moral law. I could never again, even though I engaged for the first half of my career, almost every novel I wrote was about how do you know something is true, even though I engaged with it and it consumed me because I couldn't find God, in fact, until I got past it. I knew after I read Crime and Punishment where I was heading. I knew I was heading in that direction. I think at that point, if I had been wiser, if I had talked to my older self, he would have said, look, why don't you just get baptized now, because that's where you're going. But so that was a huge, huge thing. Shakespeare, I know, it's silly to say Shakespeare, but Shakespeare formed my conception of what a human being is. I mean, I've never found him to be wrong on the subject. He shaped, and now it's funny because now I go back and I see, he didn't just come down from heaven, because Shakespeare almost seems like it's very hard to believe he was a human being, but he was, and he came at a time and place. But still, his insights into human beings and his insights into the moral order really shaped my idea of who people are and how they work. And so that was certainly, tremendously influential. And now that I go back and reread them, I realize, of course, that Plato and Aristotle had a huge effect on the way I thought, but I didn't really know it at the time because I got them. I did understand them. Recently, I almost never write in books. And recently, my son picked up one of my favorite books, a book called After Virtue, which is kind of an Aristotelian book. And I said to him, I love that book, and I can't remember a single word that's in it. I can't remember anything that's in it. And he started to read it, and he said, you can't remember what's in it because you consumed it. It's everything you think. You just took it on for yourself. And that's it. I went back and reread it. I reread it like last month. And I thought, that is exactly what happened. Same thing happened with Crime and Punishment, although that was such a great story, I could remember it. I think that happened to me with Plato and Aristotle. I just consumed them, and it kind of set it set the measure. I mean, that's where you get the idea that there is such a thing as truth, and you can't speak it, you can't speak the truth, but you can come closer to it in half measures. And those are the things I think that really, I'm sure if I sat here, I'd think of 50 more, but those are the things that really shaped me. And my reading, and just I have to mention this, that all the tough guy novels, because that was where I started. I started with the tough guy novels, and they led me into Western culture because I was looking for role models as a man, that I didn't have around me. And guys like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and Ernest Hemingway supplied those images of what a man is like, what it is like to be a man in the world. And so they were huge, because from there, they led me to the King Arthur stories, and that led me to Christianity, and that led me to basically the wider culture.
Andrew, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
It's been great. It's been great talking to you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do help us out by subscribing, rating, and reviewing Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten in the iTunes Store or wherever else you're listening to us. I'm your host, Ben Weingarten. You can find out more about the podcast at benweingarten.com/bigideas or at BHWeingarten on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.